Wow. So welcome back, everyone. We're about to start our second session. Just by way of introduction, my name is Hilton. No connection to Paris or to the hotel chain. Some of you already asked me, so I just want to get it out of the way. We're going to talk in our session about the drive for innovation. And before we start, I'd like to actually see a raise of hands on a few questions I have. How many corporates do we have in the audience right now? All right, how many startups do we have? Very good. Second question. How many of you have heard of Startup Nation Central? How many of you know what Startup Nation Central does? Maybe 3. Okay, so it just so happens that I have a short presentation. I'm just figuring it out. Okay. Green button. No. Got it. Innovation. So, just before we start, Startup Nation Central essentially leverages the deep knowledge we have on the Israeli ecosystem to let it expand and grow. We do it in multiple ways, whether we're connecting corporates, NGOs, and governments from across the globe to Israeli innovation to solve the most pressing challenges, whether by running the online innovation discovery platform called Startup Nation Finder, which through it you can explore Israeli innovation from practically anywhere in the world, and whether by actually helping several sectors in Israel expand and grow, things like agri-tech, digital health, Industry 4.0, industrial IoT, alongside fintech, cyber, and practically anything else that there is in Israel. So this is essentially what we do. The topic I really wanted to talk to you about today is how corporates can engage with the Israeli innovation ecosystem in models that are not necessarily the classic get to Israel, look at the startup scene, find a startup, acquire it, and move on from there. So the first thing, interesting enough, this is a few data points from a research that Mass Challenge did a couple of months ago, is that there is a growing understanding in the corporate world that working with startups creates a lot of benefits. Whether it's very important or mission critical for corporates to plug into the innovation streams, whether it's to explore new technologies or to gain insight into nascent trends, everything between those two elements basically requires a lot of corporations and corporates to figure out what's the best way of working with startup and creating local presence and some sort of a dialogue with a startup ecosystem. But interestingly enough, when we talk to a lot of corporates and we have a lot of these customers of ours coming in through Startup Nation Central and looking at us as a gateway to Israeli innovation, we talk a lot about, so what's the best way for that specific corporate to work with the ecosystem? So the usual suspect, which is practically became a best practice, is you go and scout, you look at several options, then you acquire a startup, you transform that into your R&D center, and from there on you expand and grow that center as needed. It's a valid practice. We see a lot of it happening. We have 350 multinational R&D centers in Israel, as you know. But the question is, did we think about all the considerations? So usually what happens is that when an R&D center is being established, the focus of that R&D center is exactly that itself. So the communications and the dialogue between that R&D center and the rest of the ecosystem is somewhat limited. Also, once a new R&D center is essentially established, it's potentially competing on the same resources as the other R&D centers in Israel, engineers, programmers, developers, and so on. So the question is, could there be alternative models to do that? And in the last 18 to 24 months, we see a different type of thinking flowing into this type of very structured processes. So in my 7 minutes or so, I'd like to suggest an alternative approach to how you can engage with the Israeli innovation ecosystem. And it's based on the level of engagement you're looking for, anything from really light all the way down to heavily invested. So the first level is what we call affiliations. It could be sponsoring events or sponsoring any type of competitions. BNY Mellon has done it a few times in Israel. access done it through a hackathon. It creates a lot of brand equity for the corporate that actually does it. So if you want to get your name around the ecosystem, this is probably a quick win and an easy way to go about doing it. It creates brand awareness, brand equity, and from there on it also helps you test the water, see if the things you're looking for are really out there, and from there on you can progress to additional, more advanced models. Another advanced model could be what we call strategic partnerships. So whether it's hooking up to an accelerator or asking an accelerator to run a specific program. Microsoft, for example, has an accelerator called the Junction, and essentially they've done a whole class or 3 classes in a row dedicated to fintech. By the way, most of these examples are fintech just because of the scene, but we have many examples from practically any field or any vertical. We can look at working through a local VC, and that gives you exposure to deal flow, gives you a lot of ability to actually concentrate your efforts on a specific vertical, and community hub, which usually convenes together the corporates, the VCs, and the ecosystem itself in order to solve specific challenges that you can put in front of them, and that creates, again, a lot of visibility and a lot of traction for a corporate who wants to actually get into Israel, but not necessarily through an R&D center. The third element is really already establishing a local presence, and that can go in many flavors, from having a scout on the ground to having a full-blown corporate VC such as Qualcomm or Cisco have already in Israel and some others, and all the way up to a corporate accelerator. Good example is the Bridge in Israel, where they have Coca-Cola on one end, Turner, and then Daimler as their corporate sponsors, and they run different programs based on what these corporates would like to have as challenges. And last but not least is what we call the all-in-one. So we could start with one of these. You can start with affiliations or go directly into a local presence scenario, or even go into a community hub. But some corporates, such as Citi, basically decided that they want to have some sort of all flavors in one. So they have an innovation lab on one end, and then another lab specifically dedicated to cybersecurity. They have a corporate VC, and they actually are part of an accelerator as well. So if you think about it, it's a very comprehensive approach. And if you look at all these examples, and you can see there are a multitude of them here, none of them have actually went through the full scale of opening an R&D center. But what they do is they interact with most of the ecosystem and are exposed to all the interesting ideas that are out there, and are not necessarily confining themselves to the walls of their own R&D center. Now, this is really the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and there are many more models within these, and I'll be happy to discuss it with you after the presentation and the session. What we do usually, this is a long-term process that we do with the customers that come through us, in the sense that we figure out with them what is the best approach for them to land in Israel, if that is their wish. And if you're interested in knowing more about Israeli innovation, you haven't already opened up shop in Israel, you're interested to explore the ecosystem, but you're not coming to Israel so often, then I would definitely invite you to use Startup Nation Finder. You'll find more than 5,800 companies over there. We update the profiles, probably about 1,000 profiles a month, and it's a very easy tool to use. It's free of charge to explore by company stage, company size, vertical, and an additional 1,600 different parameters that you can use in order to zero in on the ones that are of interest to you, get the introduction, and get the business flow moving ahead. So that was my 5 minutes of explaining to you the context of what we're all going to talk about today. And today we're actually looking at different aspects of working between corporates and startups. We'll have a panel that discusses the drive for innovation. We'll talk in a minute about how the corporate VCs are looking at the startup ecosystem, and many more. So with that in mind, I would like to actually invite our next speaker, Ulrich Quay from BMW iVentures, to take us through his presentation. Thank you very much.